Hello, everyone. Welcome back to StatTech Research's seminar series on measuring progress and well-being. I'm Kelsey O'Connor, one of the organizers. Today, we are pleased to welcome Professor Peter Howley, who will discuss immigration and subjective well-being. A quick announcement before we get started. I'm pleased to announce that we have set the dates for our annual workshop. The second Measuring Progress workshop will take place from the 6th to the 7th of June 2024. You can look for an email from us with a call for papers fairly soon. Back to today, Peter will speak for approximately 40 minutes. If you have any clarifying questions, you may ask them at any time. Otherwise, please save your questions for the end, at which time please raise your virtual hands or post your questions in the chat. During the presentation, if you're not asking a question, please keep your microphones muted. And a last reminder, we are recording the event. You'll be able to find this and past recordings on our website and YouTube channel. Now to introduce Professor Peter Howley. Peter is a professor of economics and behavioral science at the University of Leeds. Much of his recent work has focused on the economics of happiness. But beyond this, comprehending the elements that enhance quality of life, he investigates how perceived well-being can serve as a framework for a deeper understanding of social and economic behaviors. Excuse me. This ranges from topics like immigration and labor market dynamics to vaccine hesitancy. Excuse me, I'm a little sick today. I'm particularly looking forward to Peter's talk. He conducts important heterogeneity analysis on the impact of immigration of natives. And thus far, personally, I've only looked primarily at the average effects. So Peter's is going to be a nice addition. So without further ado, we are pleased to welcome Professor Peter Howley. Peter, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks for the invite, Kelsey. Hello, everybody. I'm going to talk, as Kelsey said, a little bit about immigration and well-being, but particularly subjective well-being. And as Kelsey mentioned, beyond that, trying to look at who wins and who loses from a subjective well-being perspective when it comes to immigration. Because my main rationale is to see if we can use subjective well-being, I guess, as a framework to help us better understand why people are so sharply polarized on this issue. Just maybe by way of context, what do we know about immigration and economic well-being? Well, an awful lot. It's probably one of the most common topics studied by labor economists, particularly the impacts of immigration on wages, unemployment outcomes. They're well known. Maybe there can be a little bit of debate. I think this is a fair comment. Generally, the findings would converge to null that changes in immigration flows don't really have a very substantive impact on the wage distribution when it comes to native workers. Sometimes there's heterogeneous effects, but these tend to be small across the wage distribution. That is, if you splice the data and look at very low wage native workers, you might find some small negative effects. If you look at high wage workers, you might find some small positive effects. And where you stand on the political divide in this issue, people can kind of latch on to one result or the other. But I think the main finding is that the impacts when it comes to wages and unemployment outcomes are not very substantive, at least in the UK context. Lots of other recent work looking at other objective indicators ranging from crime, educational, institutional quality, productivity, and so on. And again, the effects, to the extent that they are any, they're benign or maybe even tend towards positive when it comes to immigration. And so the general consensus, though there are some dissenting voices, I think it's fair to say, is that for the most part, we let in too few migrants, both from the perspective of natives' economic well-being, and in particular, the economic well-being of migrants themselves. What about subjective well-being? There has been a small number of longitudinal studies done to date in this area. There's been some other cross-sectional work as well, but I haven't really focused too much on that. A good starting point is work by K in Germany using a similar data set, but the German equivalent of the data that I used in these UK studies, the GSOP. And their findings was that there was a small and positive net estimated effect of changes in migrant share across local local areas or regions in Germany on the life satisfaction of natives. But this was focused on a particular demographic grouping, 16 to 64, and I'll explain a little bit later why that can be important. Ivlids, and I'm not going to pronounce that second name, they did an interesting study in the UK, and they were focused on the effect of the initial EU accession, or they looked at this as a migration shock, and they looked at the population level impacts of changes in migrant share on life satisfaction. And again, their net population level estimates were close to a zero when it comes to life satisfaction. I did a study a few years ago in the UK. I looked this time at the Generalized Health Questionnaire, another indicator of well-being. And I looked at raw aggregate numbers of migrants as opposed to migrant share, as this allows one to capture the impact of increases in population per se when it comes to looking at the well-being impacts. And again, not very substantive population level impacts, close to zero. They were negative, but quite small. Kelsey has done some work. At this time, it was across the EU. And again, I hope I'm not incorrectly saying that here, Kelsey, but again, your study found again that the immigration population shares were not significantly associated with natives' life satisfaction across the EU. What was interesting here is that this was true whether you looked at migrants from the EU or outside the EU. So again, still the estimates converged to a zero when we were looking at life satisfaction. So the question I think I pose here and that I'm really fascinated by is, how can you reconcile this with actual observed behavior? If we look at economic impacts, the effects are relatively benign. If you look at subjective well-being, again, from a net population level impact, again, the effects are relatively benign. But we have some very sharp divide on this issue, as evident in the UK with Brexit. You know, phrases like Brexit means Brexit, build a wall, and so on. So my hypothesis here is that subjective well-being, when we really look at who wins and loses from a subjective well-being perspective, we can get a better handle as to what lies behind this divide. So in terms of heterogeneity, there's already some evidence of this when looking at sociodemographic patterns in the UK. So generally the finding there is that if you're younger and wealthier and better educated, you're more likely to experience immigration positively. Your well-being is more likely to be enhanced by demographic change in your neighborhood. Conversely, if you're older, if you're poor, if you're unemployed, you're more likely to feel negative well-being, or you're more likely to experience demographic change in your neighborhood negatively from a well-being perspective. So in some of my recent work, I've been looking beyond these kind of sociodemographic patterns and just focus on psychology, like what can underlying psychological dispositions, if we look at this, can this help us get a better handle as to what may be going on when it comes to immigration and well-being. And so the core idea here is we kind of hypothesize that just some people are more predisposed to be fearful of demographic change and all it entails. And the key question then is not whether necessarily immigration is good or bad for natives, rather for whom is it good and whom is it bad and why. Although I don't like, maybe on reflection, maybe shouldn't use the words good and bad, but like who is more likely to feel negatively in terms of well-being when they're exposed to changes, demographic change in the neighborhood, and who is more likely to experience it positively. So what could be the important psychological dispositions? So I looked at here was things that I can measure in the data sets that I look at, and also variables that I would have had strong theoretical reasons to expect may moderate this relationship. So the first thing that jumped at me was national identity. And it came from a conversation with colleagues here at work where they noticed that there's very different national identities in the UK that I wasn't really aware of. That, you know, depending on whether an individual feels English or more British, for example, they tend to have a very different worldview, which I thought was interesting. So I'm using this to look at the role of national identity in moderating this relationship. So within the literature, there's generally two big categories. Of course, it's a spectrum, but I'm simplifying things, I guess. And it's ethnic versus civic conceptions are the most common. So for somebody with an ethnic conception of national identity, the best way I can describe it is they would have quite a narrow in-group. They would feel ancestry and descent is the most important attributes for shaping a sense of belonging or a sense of togetherness or a sense of national identity. Those with a more civic disposition wouldn't care a lot less about things like ancestry. For them, aspects such as just residence and respect for institutions and rules of the state would be what would be principally required. Openness to experience, it's one of the big 5 measures of personality. It's probably the one that you would most expect to be related with immigration insofar as what it captures, and that is people's openness to new experiences and so on. Particularized trust is also interesting. So quite often what's used in the literature is generalized trust. And so generalized trust would be individuals' propensity just to trust people in general. So particularized trust captures something different. Now, there could be very high, people with high particularized trust could be very high trusting, but they would place their trust principally in people they know, people they're familiar with. So it would be, what I'm looking at here is the propensity to place trust in unfamiliar people as a moderator in helping us to understand this relationship. I think one thing it's important to emphasize is that these characteristics are largely innate to the individual, although there can be some malleability, through adolescence, but generally not just who you are. So there's an evolutionary basis for these differences, and one must not think of, we'll say, high openness is good and low openness bad, and our civic national identity as being bad and ethnic identity as being good, or whatever categorization you look at. There's something that's largely beyond one's control. Again, I start off with national identity. So why would this be important? There was some really interesting work in social psychology that was a starting point for this in terms of social identity or social identity theory. And the basic idea here is that people are naturally inclined to self-categorize into an in-group versus out-group. But there will be differences across the individual into the extent to which they will classify others into an in or out group. And so my idea here is that for people with an ethnic as opposed to civic form of national identity, their subjective perception of who belongs is more likely to extend beyond, residence and into the realm of ancestry and culture and values. So depending on whether an individual has more of an ethnic versus civic conceptualization of national identity, they're likely to have very different in and out groups. And social identity theory would suggest that you're more likely to favor your in-group, or even in some cases disfavor out groups. And we all have this this trait to some extent. Akerlof and Cranton's seminal work in identity economics is also, I think, relevant here. And this speaks to concepts such as identity utility. So the idea here is that migrants may be just less likely to conform with the behavioral ideals associated with being English. And so contact with migrants may diminish the identity utility of natives who self-identify as English as opposed to British. So just in terms of measuring a national identity, individuals in the survey are asked, what's their national identity? So it's the options such as English, British, English and British, and English and Scottish, Scottish, Welsh, Irish, and so on. So there's a lot of different options, but there's two big groups, and that is whether an individual feels English or British. English and British is the next largest one. So I'm kind of using how individuals respond to this question as a marker of national identity. Now, it's not perfect in that there is a spectrum, but all things being equal, you would expect individuals who report that they feel more English as opposed to British, that it's reasonable to speculate that they're more likely to have an ethnic form of national identity. We look at individuals who feel British, on the other hand, it's reasonable to speculate that they're more likely to have a more civic conceptualization of national identity. And this is just based on previous survey research in the political science, which would suggest that individuals who feel more English as opposed to than British are more likely to place more an emphasis on ancestry and culture and so on. Why openness and particularized trust? Well, there's already lots of literature looking at the relationship between openness to experience and attitudes towards immigration. People high in openness to experience is one of the big 5 personality traits that individuals look at quite a lot. But openness to experience, those high on this trait will be those most excited by change. They're shown to be more innately interested in interacting with people from different cultures, and also less rigid in their use of stereotypes. So it's reasonable to suggest that this could be important in helping us understand if there's any understanding the immigration well-being relationship. Particularized trust, that relates to a belief that only individuals who belong to a certain group or network can be trusted. Now, again, they can be high trusting. It's just that they place that trust principally on people they know. They're less likely to place trust on people who are unfamiliar with them. So the question here in the survey I used is, are you generally a person who is fully prepared to take risks in trusting strangers, or do you avoid taking such risks? And it's a 0 to 10 scale. So it captures the principal feature of particularized trust. And that is the degree to which individuals are willing to take risks trusting unfamiliar people. Openness to experience, that's based on 3 question items as part of the big 5 event tree that's used in the Understanding Society survey data sets that I use that I'll talk about in the next slide or two. So both openness and particularized trust, I guess they can be seen as interrelated into some degree, in that from an economics perspective, they have the effect of narrowing one set of desirable choices. Low openness would predict individuals or people who would be lower propensity to engage in novel or unusual experiences, whereas particularized trust would be novel or unusual people. In terms of the methods, we use the Understanding Society dataset. It's a large-scale longitudinal household survey. It's got multiple indicators of well-being, such as the Generalized Health Questionnaire and Self-Reported Life Satisfaction. It's got about 50 individuals in each wave, and it follows them over time. And I think that is the most powerful feature of the data set. Then our statistical office here provides data relating to the estimated number of foreign-born individuals in each local authority area. And this is annual data. So by just merging these two data sets together using spatial and individual identifiers, I can relate changes in individuals' well-being with demographic change, or changes in the number of migrants living in their local area. So it's kind of within person. It's looking at, for the same individuals over time, to what extent their well-being moves up or down in response to changes in their neighborhood, demographic change. We link it with other data sets, such as the English indices of deprivation. That is just to help us to control for differences in economic and social conditions across the neighborhood, as you would reasonably speculate that migrants will be more likely to be attracted to particular types of neighborhoods, and those neighborhood characteristics in of itself may also be related to well-being. The indicators of subjective well-being. So the general health questionnaire, it's based on 12 question items. I focus a bit more on this as the most conservative of the two when we look at heterogeneity, but I also talk about life satisfaction, and this is probably even more common than the GHQ. It's how dissatisfied or satisfied are you with your life overall, and it's as simple as 7-point scale. So just in terms of the empirics, so as I mentioned briefly, in essence, we're relating changes in individual subjective well-being with annual changes in the aggregate number of migrants living in their local area. We do the standard stuff, individual, year, and region fixed effects. We also have these time variant neighborhood controls, the English indices of deprivation that I mentioned before. One may still be worried of indigeneity issues, particularly sorting of migrants into different types of neighborhoods. Also, maybe measurement error in that the data in relation to immigration, it's based on a large survey, but it's still an estimate of the number of migrants living in individuals' neighborhoods. So we also test the sensitivity to something that, to an instrumental variable approach that is used an awful lot in the labor economics domain. So essentially what we do here is we derive a predicted immigration value based on past settlement patterns. So the settlement patterns here is 2001 and 1991. So it's between 10 and 20 years prior to the current inflow. So the idea here is that migrants, when they're making the decision to where to locate, they're more likely to be attracted to areas where there were large groups of existing migrants. So we use that idea to derive a predicted immigration value to use as an instrument for current inflows. And the idea being that if you go back far enough and you have some, particularly in a fixed effect setting, that instrumental variable or that predicted value should be endogenous to well-being, that you control for for example changes in economic and social conditions and so on. So that's the starting point. And then through various interaction models, we then look at whether the relationship between immigration or changes in the number of migrants in local areas and the subjective well-being of natives differ according to their underlying psychological dispositions. So natives here are individuals that we classify as UK-born residents. So just in terms of the main effects, so this is the main effects. This is just the main fixed effects. So don't worry too much about the figures. I'll illustrate this graphically in a couple of minutes, but just to show. So when we have the full sample, we observe, this is the GHQ, the Generalized Health Questionnaire. We observe quite a small negative estimated impact on the natives' well-being as a whole. But when we splice the data into groups based on identity, we can see that it's actually concentrated on those who feel more English as opposed to British. That is, individuals who are more likely to have an ethnic as opposed to civic conceptualization of national identity. This is just the same results with no controls. You may be worried that when you start adding controls, we're actually saturating the impact of immigration on subjective well-being, that we're closing down channels of influence. So just did the same thing, just excluding all the controls. The estimates are the same, so that doesn't change anything. This is the results where we use the shift share instrument that I mentioned before. So very similar. Maybe our baseline fixed effects estimates may be a little understated, but not substantively so. We generally get the same findings. Maybe there's some measurement error in the number of in our variable capturing the number of migrants across local authority areas, and that might be putting a downward bias in our fixed effects estimates to some extent. But again, not substantively. So we see the same pattern, that to the extent that there's negative impacts when we look at the GHQ, they're heavily concentrated on this English grouping. No significant impact when we look at the British only subgroup and the English and British, and particularly when we look at the British only, the estimates are quite close to 0. This is life satisfaction. So when we look at the full sample, and I guess this is in keeping with, Kelsey's work across the EU, that when you look at life satisfaction and you look at the relationship between immigration and life satisfaction, when you look at the net population impact, it's just very close to 0. There doesn't seem to be any substantial impact. And it's quite interesting because you kind of lose a lot of interesting insights if you just focus on, I think that's a lesson for research in a general sense, that if you just focus on the net population level impact of a relationship between any variables, you miss what may be the really interesting story that's going on. So again, when we look at the English only and the British only, we can see two sharply differing impacts. For the English only, it's negative, and for the British only, it's positive. And I'll show this graphically in a minute. Let's see. So this is the graph. So this is the relationship between immigration and subjective well-being for natives who identify as English and British. So the top line here is for individuals who identify as British. So again, it's pretty close to zero. They don't seem to be affected one way or the other by inflows or by changes in the number of migrants in their local area. It's a bit different for individuals who ascribe to an English form of national identity. They seem to experience demographic change negatively in terms of their well-being. This axis here is just immigration in tens of thousands. So as the number of migrants in one's neighborhood increases, we can see that there's more likely to be a more pronounced negative impact of immigration on their well-being. This is life satisfaction. If I didn't do the study myself, I'd be a little suspicious of the graph because the lines are the exact opposite of each other. So it's just it's almost too accidental. It's almost too good. So by that I mean the relationship between immigration and subjective well-being for individuals who ascribe to an English as opposed to British national identity, they're the mirror opposite of each other. So the experience, if you think about this term and these terms, individuals who ascribe to an English national identity, they have a completely different experience when it comes to immigration in their subjective well-being terms. And just contrast that with British. I'll talk about this in a bit more later, but when you start to look at this, it's kind of becomes more understandable why there is such sharp polarization on these issues. You know, you have two broadly equal sized groups of broadly equally sized groups in the UK, and they have a completely different experience when it comes to demographic change in their neighborhood. So this is openness on the moderation role of openness in the relationship between immigration and well-being. So again, we just tried a graph to predict the relationship between immigration and subjective well-being, whether it be the GHQ or life satisfaction, depending on individual scores on these trait levels. So on the left, we have the GHQ, and its openness is on a 7-point scale, so 1 to 7. So you can see for individuals who have a very high openness score, the effect is positive, although not substantively so. But individuals who have a very low openness score, the exact opposite. So I won't go into great detail. You can kind of get an impression from the graphs that you have distinct groups in the population, and they experience immigration very differently depending on their openness scores. This is particularized trust. So again, this is a 10 or 10-point scale. So again, it's just individuals with very high particularized trust. That is, they're much less likely to feel comfortable placing trust in unfamiliar people. They experience quite a substantive negative change to their subjective well-being, even in response to moderate changes in the numbers of migrants in their local area. The opposite is true for individuals who score highly when it comes to feeling that they can trust people who are unfamiliar to themselves. So again, we get this picture that there is these sharp variation in the degree to which immigration affects people's subjective well-being, depending on how they score on these trait levels. I actually forgot to mention this, but you might be curious that these trait levels are correlated, but much less so than I actually thought. So they're quite small. So to some extent, they're capturing national identity, for example, is to some extent related to particularized trust, but not greatly so. So to a large extent, they're capturing independent psychological dispositions. At this time, with random as opposed to fixed effects, the advantage here is I can take advantage of between as well as within person variation. So the standard errors become an awful lot smaller. So that's just advantageous. Apart from being statistically significant, the differences are substantive. It's difficult always to, I think, to communicate how much demographic change impacts people's well-being. Like, one approach is to calculate compensating income variations, which is how much an individual's income would need to be compensated to compensate them for a change in, for example, a negative change to their well-being, such as from immigration. The difficulty here is the figures can be quite high because income is often endogenous to well-being, so you end up with very small income coefficients, and people equate this with willingness to pay. And I didn't want a headline that individuals are willing to pay £100,000 to be living in a neighborhood with 10,000 less migrants. So that's the difficulty. But just to give you an idea, the estimated differences in utility, that is subjective well-being, even just a mean level increase in the number of migrants when comparing people with the highest and lowest scores on these traits would be comparable to major life events such as divorce and widowhood. Now, of course, I'm looking at the highest versus lowest scores in these traits, but at the same time, a mean level change is quite small. Like a standard deviation change would be bigger. If I look at min and max, it becomes even larger again. So I suppose the main point here is that immigration does seem to matter for people's well-being, but it depends, the degree to which it matters and in what direction does depend largely on who you are from in terms of your underlying psychological dispositions. So just to finally conclude, at the start, I guess the central premise behind this work is just that subjective well-being rather than economic well-being. I think people are missing a trick here. That I think the key to understanding immigration or polarization is not to necessarily focus so much on economic well-being, but it's just rather subjective well-being. And when we use subjective well-being as the outcome variable, it just gives us a better framework to help us understand polarization on immigration issues. And general finding is that there appears to be subjective well-being winners and losers. And I guess the important thing is that one person may look at demographic change or migrants and see threats, and it's not necessarily discrimination per se. It's just who they are in terms of the degree to which they're likely to derive utility from demographic change and all it entails. And on the other hand, other individuals, depending on their personality and underlying dispositions, they may look at the same view and see opportunity. So in these circumstances, perhaps polarization is inevitable and understandable. And the reason I say this is that I've noticed sometimes in the discourse, people can make the argument that the reason why there's these sharp differences in immigration attitudes is as a result of misinformation, that we need to actually correct negative perceptions in relation to the number of migrants living in one's neighborhoods, and also to make people more aware of the economic benefits associated with immigration. And I think that's true. I think there's some behavioral evidence to support that hypothesis, but there may be limited potential to that approach when an aversion to immigration is predicated not on these factors, but rather its underlying dispositions, namely who you are and how you're more likely to experience not necessarily immigration, but the factors associated with a demographic change. The way I think about it is, somebody may be, quite off-putting if an Irish bar opened up in their neighborhood. But similarly, somebody would see that as an opportunity. So it depends on who you are, the degree to which you're more likely to experience these things positively or negatively. Thanks for your attention. This work was funded by the Nuffield Foundation, but the views expressed reflects the authors and not necessarily the foundation. And thanks to my co-authors, Mohammed Wakas, who's in the University of Bradford, Neil Ocean in the University of Warwick for research assistance on this work. So any questions, feel free.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's perfect, quick, succinct, and informative. Everyone, please feel free to write in the chat or to raise your hand when you have questions, and we will call on you. And I think I will get us started, Peter. So putting, I believe, two parts together, when we look at the objective circumstances, we see that in general, there's not a huge impact on nations as a whole. I'm wondering if, however, those results are also heterogeneous, and maybe part of what's behind this. So we have the people who are, let's just take open to new experience. Do you think that they are experiencing different objective circumstances as a result of immigration? Or is this really just about different perceptions or feelings that these people have? Threats to social cohesion is the primary channel operating for people who have, say low trust, or I guess it's high particularized trust, or low openness to new experience. Is it just the subjective channel, or is there something objective happening too?
I think probably, I don't think it's either or, Kelsey. I'd say it's probably a bit of both. And the reason I say that is if I was to correlate, we'd say the socio-demographic pattern. So I talked about how there's these socio-demographic heterogeneity. If I was to correlate that with some of these traits, there is a correlation, but quite small. So I could find stuff that's statistically significant, but it doesn't explain a huge degree of the variation, for example, in openness. For example, there seems to be some differences in openness across the age distribution, but it's not very substantive. And similar when we look at particularized trust. So I do think you're right. I think there is likely to be something else that going on in terms of objective reality of the situation, in that people low on openness, for example, maybe they're more, if there is any negative economic impacts, it's likely that they may be the ones that's most impacted. So I see your point, but I think it's largely the other side. I think it's largely actually it's individuals' underlying psychology in terms of how they view and experience the world around them, as opposed to objective economic threats per se.
Great. Chiara, you're next, but I just wanted to follow up just a tiny bit here because it's on the same subject. So ethnic identity is, older people more likely to have, let's say, an English ethnic identity, or is it the lower educated people who might also be less open to new experience?
Well, in terms of ethnic identity, I know it's very much there is an age pattern there, in that it's older people who are more likely to they're more likely to have an ethnic form of national identity, and I would speculate that may be because individuals who are younger, they're just more likely to have been exposed to different ethnicities in their formative years growing up in terms of demographic change. So they're more likely to have maybe a more civic form of national identity. Now, again, it's not a very big predictor or anything, Kelsey. It's just that there is that relationship, but there's lots and lots of young people with an ethnic form of identity as opposed to civic, and vice versa. It's just there might be a somewhat higher proportion in the older distribution. And apologies, I forgot the other question in terms of openness. Was there a second one?
Oh, it was education. So I'm just thinking your results might partially explain some of the earlier ones that showed the heterogeneities by education and, and I'm just partially explaining heterogeneities by education and age.
Oh, no, I agree, because those factors are correlated. But I suppose my point is that they're not correlated very highly. That they are predictive, but I take your point.
Yeah, not to disagree, just an idea. Chiara, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. I have a couple of questions. One is a clarification question. Maybe I didn't catch this, but who are your English and British? With the are you the people in the study are people that identify themselves as British if they are part of the other nations?
No, I see where the complexity comes. So essentially what happens in the survey, in one of the waves, every individual is asked what is their national identity. So they're given various options. So it's complicated in the UK that there's so many. So the options are, for example, English and British. They're the two big ones. But there's also English and British together, and there's also Scottish, Irish,
And Welsh,
and English and Welsh, and so many. So what I do is I just principally focus on the English and British, and also English and British. They're the three big groups. I dropped all the others because they're just small numbers, and I've no a priori reason to believe somebody who ascribes to having a Scottish identity will be more or less likely to attribute to an ethnic or civic form of national identity. But I would have strong theoretical grounds to speculate that individuals who ascribe to an English as opposed to British form of national identity, they're more likely to place more emphasis on ancestry as a criterion for national belonging. And that's based on just survey research in the UK.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, and then the second question is, so basically you are showing us that this identification or cultural trait drives the attitude to the relation between immigration and well-being. But is it not that you are capturing something else? And indeed, it would be nice maybe to see certain controls, or I'm thinking about an English that somebody that identifies as English and lives in a place like Newcastle, somebody that identifies as English and lives in Birmingham, and another that lives in London. So they face very different situation in terms both of composition and say density and relevance of the immigrant population. So maybe you are capturing underlying socio-demographic factors there.
Yeah, I see your point. I think maybe with my language, first of all, I know what you mean in terms of drives. I think I've got to be careful. Like there's this heterogeneous pattern according to these trait levels, and I can speculate based on theory as to what's driving it. But in essence, it's an interaction effect, so we kind of can't really know. But so I think that's important. But I think in relation to your second point, I'm less worried about your second point, in that should be taken care of in the kind of fixed effect setting and the time variant neighborhood and social controls. So essentially we're looking at within person variation for the same individuals, to what extent their well-being changes in response to changes to immigration. And if they've got different neighborhood characteristics in which they're living in, that should be observed by the fixed effects or the time variant controls we've got in the model. But you're right, you would imagine that immigration itself would have an impact based on the number of migrants that's in the actual area itself. So I guess that's maybe something I need to think a little bit more about in terms of modeling the baseline specification.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
For example, you could do nonlinear relations.
Yeah, interestingly, not a whole pile there actually. So I have done that, but yeah, I expect it. I observe a curve, but just not a very substantive one. But
Andrew's up next.
Hi, Peter. I hope you can hear me.
Hey, Andrew.
The two things that occur to me, I guess, is the heterogeneity that I would expect to be the most important would be political in terms of left-right identification. And maybe that's very strongly correlated with some of these things you're looking at, like ethnic identification and trust in others and so on. But my feeling is why immigration is such a big political football is because it affects the kind of base voters of different political parties. And makes them happy or unhappy, and that makes them vote or not vote for the incumbent, as George Ward has shown. So anyway, long story short, I would look for left-right wing identification as a moderator. And the other thing might be interesting to look at is the flow rather than the stock of migration, if there's enough action going on there to see whether it's new arrivals rather than the people who've been living around the corner for 30 years who seem to provoke a reaction, positive or negative. Thanks.
Yep, thanks. I'll have a look at the data set, see in terms of the left, right. So I like that idea. There might be something in terms of certainly the individuals are asked who they vote for, so maybe that could be a proxy. I guess the way I kind of conceptualize it, though, I think the left-right ideology is shaped by these dispositions as opposed to the other way around. But I still think there's value. I should look at that. Yeah, the flow rather than the stocks. I'll think a little bit more about that, just empirically how to do it. It gets complicated, but in terms of precision and so on. But yeah, I'll give that some thought. Thanks, Andrew.
If I'm just piggyback on that real quick, Cesare, I think you're next, and then David. If you look at longer term relations, also right now you have annual data, so you're getting annual, within person changes. With exposure theory, perhaps people are so their disposition doesn't change, their openness is the same, but their perceived threat declines as they become greater exposed to the number of migrants in the region. And so that's related to Andrew's talk about looking at flows. But also if you look at 2 to 5 year changes instead of annual changes, that might also get at that same point. Yeah, there is, I think I can see what you're getting at, Kelsey. There is this literature in psychology, is this idea, for example, trust. Trust will actually improve once people are exposed to what was commonly perceived as a threat. So the idea being then, if individuals are more exposed to migrants, their trust levels improve. So there is that theoretic. I'm not convinced on the empirics in that work, because I think they're capturing other things. And I've kind of looked. I've got that comment before. I've kind of looked. It's kind of a common reported phenomenon in the social psychology literature, but I'm not quite convinced. And also, I think these things are more immutable. I think it does really largely reflect who you are. It takes a lot to change an individual's propensity to trust or openness to experience. I think it's more challenging to do so than maybe commonly thought. But you're right. It is something to actually consider. Great, thanks. Cesare, go ahead.
Thank you. Just one clarification question. So, like, you're reporting the well-being of both natives and immigrants?
Oh no, sorry, I must admit, no, just the natives. So UK-born individuals, how their well-being responds to changes in the number of migrants living in their local area.
Okay. Then are you capturing as well the second generation, meaning people who are natives to some extent, but with immigration background? And if yes, do you think this may be different? May have any impact? May have different behavior?
I do. I haven't captured it because we end up splicing the data into smaller and smaller groups, so things get noisier. But you're right, there would be strong grounds to believe that first, second generation migrants and so on, that in of itself will have heterogeneous well-being effects. That particularly when we look at these channels, for example, people are more likely to, or you would speculate at least, that people who have an ethnic form of national identity, they're more likely to see new arrivals as part of an outgroup as opposed to migrants who have been here longer term. And similarly, ethnic composition of migrants. I suggest that is likely to play a role in the degree to which people experience demographic change negatively or positively. So you're right, just these things are just challenging to measure in this empirical setting, but it is a good point.
Great, David, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Very interesting presentation. I have a thought about the kind of story you might tell on the basis of the data that you're looking at, the analysis you've done. Perhaps implicitly, what I hear in your presentation is that the reactions of people to the presence of immigrants, that reaction basically originates in the individuals themselves. their characteristics, their situations, etc. And I understand that way of seeing things, but living in the UK, listening to the things that our delightful Tory overlords say about immigration on a regular basis, I'm thinking that some of the negative reactions, that is something that is explicitly intended by the type of politician that say the things that Tories say about immigrants. So it's sort of a weird comment perhaps, but what I have in mind is the idea that an alternate type of story has to do with the way that the kind of reactions we see, those are explicitly elicited by certain types of politicians. It's not really a comment about the analysis. Again, it's more a comment about the type of story you might tell.
Yeah, I think I need to think about that. I think I see where you're going, I suppose. But is one other way of thinking about it is, so that message framing, and like I know exactly what you mean, but that message framing itself, that is likely only impactful for a certain cohort of the population. And then the question then is, why is it impactful? So it comes back to, okay, it could be impactful because they're more likely to see this as a negative message because the people they're talking about are more likely to be perceived as an outgroup. So I see it's like a chicken or an egg problem to some extent. But yeah, I need to think about the way to frame this. My overall goal is to try and frame it in a non-political way as possible. That it's just that this is just the empirical findings. Some people win and lose, and it's not a commentary on immigration or migrants or anything like that. It's just to help us understand why people kind of feel the way they do. But I do take your point there. I need to think a bit more about that.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Because I can, okay. So I like the way you formulated your research question just a second ago. You want to basically see who is winning and who is losing. And I wonder, perhaps the most direct way to answer that question is by trying to predict the probability that migration increases or not the chances to be, at the lower end of the well-being distribution. So rather than running a lot of regression with interactions, that basically allows you to focus on specific factors, but you can hardly be exhaustive. For instance, I can imagine of various other moderating variables: religiosity, trust in institutions, corruption. Why not trying to run, for instance, some quantile regressions and trying to predict the probability of the natives increase people that are dissatisfied with their lives? And this could reconcile your work with what Andrew Crack was saying not long ago. So basically, you have a smaller but growing share of the population that is becoming unhappy. And this might explain polarization, might explain populism.
Yeah. I think I see where you're going. So to see to what extent immigration predicts this. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the suggestion there is.
Perhaps I haven't been very clear. Basically, rather than running a regression and trying to predict the average, why don't you try to predict the probability of being in the tail, in the lower tail?
Yeah. Okay, sorry. Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, there could be some, as you said, quantile regression there to see if there's heterogeneous effects across the life to satisfaction scale. So maybe I look at predicting misery as opposed to happiness.
It's possible that immigration is actually polarizing the distribution of life satisfaction in a country towards the two tails. On average, you might find no change, but in practice, you have a population, inequality of well-being that is increasing.
Yeah, no, thank you.
That might drive populism.
No, I get you. Thanks for that. Yeah, it'd be a nice way to actually, yeah, you're right. So everybody could converge to 4 on the life satisfaction scale. Maybe what's happening is you're just shifting people from the 2s to the 1s and the 6s to the 7s, and the average is the same, but the distribution of responses is changing. Yeah, thanks for that. I'll look into that. That's a good suggestion.
I have a piggyback comment. So a way to do this in a different way. So imagine that you estimate basically a random slope, or you allow the coefficient on migration to vary from person to person.
Mm-hmm.
Then you collect those who experienced a negative decline versus those who had a positive. And then you have group membership, those who are negatively affected versus those who are positively affected, and you try to predict that. So you have a 2-stage regression, and the second regression is group membership, essentially. And you can use personality characteristics, age, sociodemographic characteristics to help predict essentially whether or not you were negatively or positively affected by migration.
Yeah, thanks. That's followed up. Yeah, I guess kind of latent class model type of thing. You kind of just get a group membership. Yeah, I could do that.
I don't see any other questions at this point. Anyone have a burning question?
It's my Christmas party, so good. So good.
Oh, Cesare asks, does anyone have a reliable reference on the well-being of natives, first and second generation immigrants? Cesare, I can follow up with you if you want afterwards. Yeah.
Just to the audience, if some papers that I missed.
Yeah. And Peter, you said you have a Christmas party to go to, so I guess we should let you go.
Yeah, thanks for joining, and thanks for all the helpful comments. Kelsey, thanks for the invite, and see some of you in conferences, I'm sure.
Yep.
And take care.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was great. So
Okay.
have a good night.
Cheers.
Yeah.
Bye.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Nice meeting you.